friends, welcome back to my channel. It's Tori. Today we need to talk about Shogun. And I know that you're thinking of this Shogun, which is the brand new TV series that looks absolutely incredible, and it's all over the internet right now, as it should be. But I want to dial us back just a little bit, because if you are excited about this show and you've been seeing it everywhere and you're like, what is this? Or, man, I'm so excited they finally made this into a TV series so I don't have to read it, or whatever combination of those things you might be, I want to talk to you about the book that inspired this incredible TV series and why you should read it. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a fantasy reader and I read a lot of books, and I read a lot of big books, like these. I've read all of these. So while I am no stranger to a chonky read, I will admit to still being intimidated by them every once in a while, and Shogun was no different. Now, I'm aware that this kind of a book is what we would consider a commitment. If you are looking at this book wondering, is this actually worth reading 1,300 pages? The answer to that, in my opinion, is yes. So let's talk about it. There has been a rise of epic storytelling on screen, and I'm really not mad about it. I mean, we can go all the way back into the kind of Star Wars era, the Lord of the Rings era, then we had the Game of Thrones era, we've had tons of great epic storytelling in between all of those things. We've had also historical TV series that have delved into some amazing parts of world history, and I think people just have really been loving these grand scale stories where we get to follow along with these characters through these really brutal and complex worlds with all the betrayals and the tension and the succession of kingdoms, and just, it's a lot, but we love it. We love to see that big epic tale with these characters that we really fall in love with and follow throughout an entire, lengthy period of time. The really cool thing about these stories being broadcast to a large part of the population in visual form is that it is bringing a lot of attention to the stories that inspired them. I mean, we've had Dune, we've had Lord of the Rings, we've had Game of Thrones, and these are all just fantasy books, which I'm bringing up because I personally am a fantasy fan, but you get the idea. They're bringing a lot of attention to the books behind the story. And I love that Shogun is coming out, because I think that if anybody has been hesitant to pick it up, or if somebody didn't even know it was based on a book and they start digging in a little bit, they are going to find this gem. The cool part about something like Shogun is I think it has a wider spread even than a lot of the fantasy epic stories that we see in visual form. And the reason for that is you are going to attract a large part of the fantasy loving crowd, but at the same time you're also going to reach people who have a deep love of historical storytelling, of digging into world history and all of the incredible, wild things that have happened on Earth since it began. And I love that this is such a great overlap series that potentially could draw in a lot of different types of audiences. Now, having not seen the show yet, I'm very excited to just binge the whole thing once I get that far, but I already know that there is no possible way that they can cram everything in this book into the episodes of that show. I have every faith that they're going to do an amazing job. However, I also know that there is going to be so much more in this version of the story than in the visual media. So let's talk about overall why Shogun as a story is so brilliant and why you should dig in further. This book is an epic scale study of political strategy, of the succession of government, of the rule of nations, of the consequences of decisions made by one person sometimes, like the ripple effect that comes out of that. There's so many layers to this story of how every tiny little step in the decisions made by the characters in the story affected history as we know it. Reading historical fiction or historical accounts like this, I think really gives us a glimpse into how the world really hasn't changed, I think, as much as we all think it has sometimes, and how a lot of the same motivations that people had in feudal Japan or the medieval era or back even farther are very similar to a lot of the driving motivations that we have as people now. With this story, you're going to get a first-hand glimpse into the complex web that was spun between feudal Japan and its surrounding geographical countries, and also the countries that were tied to it through trade, through alliance, etc., like Portugal and Spain and England, etc. Because this was at a time where Japan was really closed off to the outside world, but the outside world was really starting to creep in, and all of the implications of that culturally for Japan and the countries that they were allied with or trading with was just a huge monumental part of how the world history at that time was shaped. I also think that this book is a fantastic gateway for Western readers to kind of step into that incredibly important time in history from the perspective of a character who, like them, is learning about the culture and all of the different complexities that make up feudal Japan from square one. Blackthorn is our main protagonist in this story, and he is a shipwrecked English ship's pilot who ends up on the shores of feudal Japan, and he is forced to very quickly learn and adapt to survive in a culture that is so drastically different from his own. And I think that the character arc of Blackthorn alone, going from completely foreign to this place that he has found himself in, and just the judgment that he has and the prejudices that he has, and the slow breakdown of his mindsets and opinions. The story arc we go through with Blackthorn is honestly just incredible in its own right, and I think it has a lot to say about, you know, being put into a very vastly different culture and the prejudices that we take in with us to that, and how those can be either solidified or broken down depending on what happens. Now, the other thing that's really cool about this book is, despite the fact that it is 1,300 pages long, which I'll grant you is a lot, it's broken up into different parts. As you can see, I tabbed the different parts of the story so that I would know when the first one and the second one and the third one, etc. ended. And because it's broken up into parts, it almost feels like you're reading a bunch of shorter books in a series, which makes this story a lot easier to break up and read in bite-sized chunks. The prose style of this story is also not dense. I never felt like I was being lost in the prose, or that I couldn't figure out what Clavell was trying to say in a certain part of the story. It's incredibly accessible, so for anybody who reads at all, honestly, I think that this book is not as scary as it seems at first glance. Also, because we're being introduced to the country and the characters through Blackthorn's perspective, we're given this kind of slow build, and we're exposed to a little bit more and then a little bit more, and it sort of expands slowly out from Blackthorn's original landing on the shores of Japan in a way that allows you to kind of slowly build your understanding of who's involved and what's going on and how everyone is connected, because it is complex. But again, Clavell was really smart in the way that he went about this. He didn't try to tell you the tale from the perspective of someone who had been living in this complex web of Japanese politics their entire life. He introduces us to this incredibly complex world through the eyes of someone who has no concept of what's going on, which I actually think is a really brilliant way to introduce new readers to this kind of a story. Speaking of characters, when you're telling a big epic story like this, you have to have characters who will be able to carry that weight through this length of a story. That is really difficult, and in order to do that, you need characters that will pull you on an emotional journey, and they will be able to stand up to that level for that long. Now, I've talked about Blackthorn a little bit and why I think he's a really brilliant protagonist for this story, but I want to highlight just two other characters that are kind of in our main cast. The first one is Toranaga. Toranaga is the Japanese lord who is one of the ruling council members, and he is basically at odds with the rest of the council, and they're trying to get him thrown out of his position. Toranaga is the complexity of this story manifested in a character. He is the strategist. He is constantly thinking and shifting and taking small steps that he knows will affect the big game down the road. The slow build of following along with all of the little decisions and movements that Toranaga makes throughout this story is just so incredibly satisfying. It is a roller coaster, you guys, okay? Like, it is a roller coaster. I'm not going to lie, and I love that about it because you never know what is going to happen next. There's an unpredictability of it that is incredibly thrilling to read. The other character that I want to briefly highlight here is a character that is one of my favorites that I read last year in 2023, and she has very quickly become one of my favorite female characters in any book I have ever read, and that is Mariko. Mariko is the interpreter who begins working with Blackthorn fairly soon after he arrives in feudal Japan. She is in Toranaga's family, she works for him, and she is the quiet strategist behind the scenes. Like, Toranaga is the figurehead of this mighty Japanese noble family, and Mariko is the cog kind of by which the rest of the world spins in this story, and she is just brilliantly written. She is a brilliant character. I loved her so much. So if you are looking for a very complex, very layered, strong female character, Mariko takes the absolute cake for me. I love her so much. There are so many other characters in this book that I could talk about for another hour that just round out this incredibly complicated cast of beautifully written, nuanced characters. I love it. Each one of them feels like they belong in the story, like they have something to add, and there isn't a wasted space anywhere in this book, which absolutely amazed me. So if I've gotten you this far and you're intrigued by this story, which I really hope you are because it's incredible, I want to give you a few pointers for, okay, if you want to read this book, what is an easier way to go about doing that? How do we read this book? The writing is not difficult to wade through. You're not going to feel like you're wading through a swamp. I've been there. I don't want to recommend a book like that for people that I don't think would enjoy it. And like I mentioned before, because it's split up into parts, that makes it very easy for you to take it in chunks, to read a little bit as often as you feel like is right for you. What I did personally is I split up the book into 3 parts, and I read, I think each of those parts has 2, or like there's one long one, I can't remember exactly, but I read it over 3 months, and I picked a chunk that I read through each of those months. And I also had a discussion with my other booktube friends who were reading it at the time, and I'm going to link those. I'll put the first one up here in the cards, and I'll also link them down in the description box below so you guys can follow along with those if you want to hear the discussions that we had after each part of this book as kind of a milestone. We had some amazing discussion about the characters and the plot line of these parts of the story, and it was so much fun to read it with friends. So that's another suggestion I have is, you know, look for some group on the internet, or if you have some buddies that are watching the show with you that might want to read it together, definitely have fun reading it as a group. But if you are reading it by yourself and you want to hang out in our discussions, definitely check those out down below and go give those a watch. I would definitely recommend as well to give yourselves a few chapters to kind of immerse into the story and get your bearings, because like Blackthorn, you're kind of dumped into this world very suddenly, and it can feel a little jarring at first, and I think that that's part of the story experience, because that's exactly how our protagonist, our main character, is feeling when he's dumped on the shores of this country that he knows literally nothing about. And I think that, you know, kind of giving yourself some time to really settle in and get a feel for the rhythm of the story is really important. The show is going to be amazing. I literally cannot wait to get started watching it. But I know that a lot of attention is hopefully going to be spinning from the show to the book once people find out that a book exists, or if you're somebody that, you know, was thinking about reading the book but was always intimidated by it and thought, well, maybe I'll watch the TV show instead. Totally fine. But I still want to really encourage you to pick up this book and to let yourself have the full experience of James Clavell's Shogun. I think this book is an incredible reading experience, and I would love for you to have the same one that I did. So feel free to ask any questions down in the comments below. Let me know if you've read it, if you're thinking about reading it, what you think of the TV show so far. I hope you guys are having a fantastic week. I hope you are reading 5-star reads, and I will see you in the next video.